The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier town of Copper Creek in the summer of 1882. Heat waves danced off the sun-baked adobe buildings like ghostly spirits, and the only sounds breaking the afternoon silence were the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of weathered wood expanding in the heat. This was the kind of day when sensible folks stayed indoors, sipping cool water from ceramic jugs and waiting for the blessed relief of evening. But Jesse, the Shadow McKenna, was not sensible folk. He sat astride his coal-black stallion, Midnight, at the crest of a rocky hill overlooking the town. His dark eyes, the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes, surveyed the settlement below with the calculating gaze of a man who had learned to read danger in every shadow. At 28, Jesse had already earned a reputation that stretched from the Texas Panhandle to the California gold fields. Some called him a ghost rider who could appear and disappear like morning mist. Others whispered he was the fastest gun west of the Mississippi River. Jesse's weathered leather duster hung open in the heat, revealing a pair of pearl-handled Colt .45 revolvers strapped to his hips. His black hat was pulled low over eyes that had seen too much violence for someone so young. 3 days' worth of stubble darkened his angular jaw, and a thin scar ran from his left temple to his cheekbone, a souvenir from a close encounter with a bounty hunter's blade 2 years prior. "What do you think, Midnight?" Jesse murmured, patting his horse's sleek neck. "Looks peaceful enough down there. Maybe too peaceful." The horse snorted and pawed the ground as if sensing his rider's unease. Jesse had learned to trust his instincts during his 7 years as an outlaw, and right now those instincts were telling him that Copper Creek held secrets beneath its quiet exterior. Jesse McKenna hadn't started life as an outlaw. Born on a small ranch in Texas, he'd been the son of honest cattle ranchers who'd worked their land with calloused hands and hopeful hearts. But when a corrupt railroad company had used hired guns to steal his family's land, killing his parents in the process, 15-year-old Jesse had picked up his father's guns and chosen a different path. He'd spent years hunting down the men responsible, and somewhere along the way he'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Now, with a bounty of $2,000 on his head, a fortune in those days, Jesse was both hunter and hunted. He robbed from wealthy railroad barons and corrupt politicians, earning him the grudging respect of common folk who saw him as a champion against injustice. But he was still an outlaw, and that meant always looking over his shoulder, always ready to draw his guns, always alone. As Jesse studied the town below, his attention was caught by movement near the general store. A young woman emerged into the harsh sunlight, her auburn hair catching the light like polished copper. Even from his distant vantage point, Jesse could see she carried herself with grace and purpose. She wore a simple blue dress that spoke of practical elegance rather than frivolous fashion, the kind of clothing chosen by someone who worked for a living but took pride in her appearance. The woman paused to speak with an elderly man loading supplies into a wagon. Jesse watched as she helped him lift a heavy sack of flour, her movements showing strength and kindness in equal measure. Something about her captured his attention in a way that surprised him. In his line of work, Jesse had learned not to notice such things. Personal attachments were dangerous luxuries an outlaw couldn't afford. But there was something different about this woman, something that made him lean forward in his saddle for a better look. "Come on, boy," Jesse finally said to his horse. "Let's go see what Copper Creek has to offer." As they descended the hill, Jesse's trained eyes automatically cataloged the town's defenses and escape routes, a habit that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. The main street was wide enough for a quick getaway, with several side alleys that could provide cover. He noted the sheriff's office, a sturdy building with iron bars on the windows and what looked like a competent lawman sitting on the front porch, whittling a piece of wood with practiced hands. Sheriff Tom Bradley was indeed a competent lawman. At 55, he'd been keeping the peace in various frontier towns for over 20 years. He had the weathered face of a man who'd seen both the best and worst of human nature, and the steady hands of someone who'd drawn his gun when necessary but preferred to solve problems with words when possible. As Jesse rode into town, Sheriff Bradley's experienced eyes took note of the newcomer, the way he sat his horse, the quality of his weapons, the alertness in his posture that marked him as either a very careful man or a very dangerous one. Jesse guided Midnight to the hitching post outside the Copper Creek Saloon, a 2-story building with batwing doors and the tinny sound of an out-of-tune piano drifting from within. As he dismounted, he caught sight of the auburn-haired woman again. She was now at the bank, conducting business with the kind of confident efficiency that suggested she was no stranger to financial matters. "Afternoon, stranger," came a gravelly voice from behind him. Jesse turned slowly, his hand instinctively moving closer to his gun. Sheriff Bradley approached with the measured pace of a man who'd learned not to make sudden movements around armed strangers. "Sheriff," Jesse nodded politely, touching the brim of his hat. Up close, he could see that Bradley was older than he'd appeared from a distance, but his eyes were sharp and alert. This was not a man to underestimate. "Don't believe I've seen you in Copper Creek before," Bradley said, his tone conversational but watchful. "Name's Tom Bradley. I keep the peace around these parts." "Jake Morrison," Jesse replied, using one of several false names he'd cultivated over the years. "Just passing through. Thought I might rest my horse and get a hot meal before moving on." It was a believable story. Copper Creek sat on one of the main trails heading west, and drifters were common enough. Sheriff Bradley studied Jesse for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in details that would escape most observers. He noted the quality of Jesse's guns, the calluses on his hands that spoke of long hours practicing with those weapons, and the way the young man's eyes never stopped moving, constantly alert for threats. "Well, Jake Morrison," the sheriff said finally, "you're welcome in Copper Creek as long as you keep your nose clean. We're a peaceful town and we aim to keep it that way." "Wouldn't have it any other way, Sheriff," Jesse replied with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. As Sheriff Bradley walked away, Jesse felt the familiar tension that came with assuming a false identity. One slip, one person who recognized him from a wanted poster, and he'd be fighting for his life again. But that was the price of the path he'd chosen, and he'd learned to live with the constant danger. Jesse pushed through the batwing doors of the saloon, his eyes automatically adjusting to the dimmer interior. The Copper Creek Saloon was typical of frontier drinking establishments: rough wooden floors, a long bar made from polished oak, and tables scarred by years of card games and spilled whiskey. A few locals nursed their drinks in the afternoon heat, speaking in low voices about cattle prices and the prospects for rain. The bartender was a heavy-set man with graying hair and arms like tree trunks. He looked up as Jesse approached the bar, his expression professionally neutral. "What'll it be, stranger?" "Whiskey. The good stuff if you have it." The bartender reached for a bottle on the top shelf, pouring a generous measure into a clean glass. Jesse noted approvingly that the man knew quality when he saw it. His clothes and weapons marked him as someone who could afford better than rotgut whiskey. "New in town?" the bartender asked as Jesse sipped his drink. "Just arrived. Seems like a nice, quiet place." "That it is. We like it that way." The bartender leaned against the bar, clearly ready for conversation. "Name's Bill Thompson. I own this establishment. Been here 15 years come November." Jesse introduced himself as Jake Morrison and settled in to gather information. In his experience, bartenders were often the best sources of local intelligence. They heard everything and saw everyone who mattered in a town. "You folks have any trouble with outlaws or raiders out here?" Jesse asked casually. Bill shook his head. "Not much. Sheriff Bradley keeps things pretty calm, and we're far enough off the beaten path that the real bad elements don't bother us much. We had some trouble with cattle rustlers last spring, but the sheriff and some of the ranchers ran them off quick enough." "Ranchers, you say? This good cattle country?" "Some of the best in Arizona territory. The Hartwell Ranch about 5 miles north of town runs near 3,000 head. Old Marcus Hartwell came out here 20 years ago with nothing but a wagon, a wife, and a dream. Now he's one of the most successful ranchers in the territory." Jesse filed this information away. Wealthy ranchers sometimes made tempting targets for his particular brand of wealth redistribution, though he made it a point never to steal from honest, hard-working folks. His war was with the corrupt and powerful, not with people who'd earned their success through honest labor. "Hartwell have a family?" Jesse asked, thinking of the auburn-haired woman he'd seen. Bill's face lit up with genuine warmth. "Oh yes indeed. His daughter Rose is about the prettiest and smartest young lady you'll ever meet. Graduated from that fancy school back east, but she came home to help run the ranch. She's got her mother's beauty and her father's head for business. Half the young men in 3 counties have come calling, but she hasn't given any of them the time of day. Rose. Even her name was beautiful." Jesse found himself wondering about this rancher's daughter who had captured his attention from a distance. What was she like? What made her smile? What dreams did she harbor in her heart? These were dangerous thoughts for an outlaw to be thinking, and Jesse forced himself to focus on more practical matters. He finished his whiskey and paid for a room upstairs, telling Bill he planned to rest for a day or two before continuing his journey. As evening approached, Jesse stood at his window watching the town come alive with the cooler air. Lanterns began to flicker to life in windows, and he could smell the aroma of cooking food drifting from various establishments. It reminded him of the home he'd lost so many years ago, of quiet evenings when his family had gathered around their simple table to share both food and stories of their day. A movement across the street caught his attention. The auburn-haired woman, Rose Hartwell, he now knew, emerged from the general store carrying a basket of supplies. She moved with purposeful grace toward a sturdy buckboard wagon, where an older man waited with patient kindness written in every line of his weathered face. This had to be Marcus Hartwell, Rose's father. Jesse could see the family resemblance in their strong jawlines and alert eyes. The rancher appeared to be in his 50s, with silver-streaked brown hair and the kind of build that came from decades of hard physical work. When Rose reached the wagon, her father helped her up to the seat with the gentle courtesy of a man who cherished his daughter. As the Hartwells prepared to leave town, Rose glanced up at the saloon's second-story windows. For just a moment, her eyes met Jesse's across the distance. Even in the fading light, he could see they were green, the deep green of spring grass after rain. Something passed between them in that brief moment, a recognition that neither could have explained if asked. Then Rose looked away, speaking to her father as he guided their wagon out of town. Jesse watched until they disappeared into the gathering dusk, troubled by feelings he thought he'd buried years ago. That night, Jesse lay on the narrow bed in his rented room, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the frontier town settling into sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonesome song to the stars. The sound seemed to echo the restlessness in his own heart, the yearning for something he couldn't name, for a life he'd never allowed himself to imagine. For the first time in years, Jesse McKenna found himself wondering what it would be like to be someone else. Someone who could walk into a general store without checking for escape routes. Someone who could smile at a pretty girl without calculating the danger it might bring to both of them. Someone who could build a future instead of running from the past. But as the night deepened around him, Jesse reminded himself of the harsh truth he'd learned at 15. Some choices couldn't be undone, and some paths led to places from which there was no return. He was an outlaw with a price on his head, and Rose Hartwell was an innocent rancher's daughter who deserved better than the danger his presence would bring to her life. Yet even as he told himself these sensible things, Jesse couldn't forget the moment when their eyes had met across the dusty street. In that brief instant, he'd seen something in her gaze that haunted him. A spark of curiosity, of recognition, of possibility that made his carefully guarded heart beat just a little faster. As sleep finally claimed him, Jesse's dreams were filled with green eyes and auburn hair, with the scent of roses blooming wild on the prairie, and with the dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, even an outlaw might find redemption in the love of a good woman. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made the distant mountains look close enough to touch. Jesse woke before sunrise as was his habit. Years of living as an outlaw had taught him that early risers lived longer than late sleepers. He dressed quickly in his travel clothes, dark pants, a white cotton shirt, and a brown leather vest that concealed a shoulder holster containing a smaller backup pistol. After strapping on his gun belt and settling his black hat at just the right angle, Jesse made his way downstairs to the saloon's main room. Bill Thompson was already behind the bar, preparing for the day ahead by wiping down glasses and checking his inventory of bottles. "Morning, Jake," Bill called out cheerfully. "You're up early for a man who's just passing through." "Old habits," Jesse replied with a slight smile. "Any chance of getting some breakfast? My wife Martha makes the best flapjacks and bacon this side of Denver. I'll have her fix you up something special." As Jesse waited for his meal, he found himself drawn to the window that looked out over the main street. Already the town was beginning to stir with activity. The blacksmith was firing up his forge, sending sparks and smoke into the morning air. Mrs. Henderson, the schoolmarm, was sweeping the steps of the small schoolhouse where she taught the local children their letters and numbers. And there, coming down the street with the sunrise painting golden highlights in her hair, was Rose Hartwell. She rode alone on a beautiful chestnut mare, sitting her saddle with the easy confidence of someone who'd been riding since childhood. Today she wore practical ranch clothes, a split skirt for riding, a white blouse, and a leather vest similar to Jesse's own. Her hair was pulled back in a practical braid, but several strands had escaped to frame her face with gentle curls. Jesse found himself moving closer to the window, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. There was an independence about Rose that intrigued him, a strength that seemed to radiate from her very posture. In his travels he'd met many women, some tough as nails from frontier living, others soft and helpless from privileged backgrounds. Rose Hartwell seemed to combine the best of both worlds, strong enough to handle herself in this harsh land, yet retaining a grace and dignity that spoke of good breeding and education. As Rose dismounted in front of the bank, Jessie noticed Sheriff Bradley approaching her with a concerned expression on his weathered face. Even from a distance, Jessie could see that their conversation was serious. Rose's posture grew tense, and she glanced around the street with what looked like worry. "Here's your breakfast, Jake," Martha Thompson announced, setting down a plate loaded with golden flapjacks, crispy bacon, and scrambled eggs. "Hope you're hungry." "Thank you, ma'am. It looks delicious." Jesse reluctantly turned away from the window, but his thoughts remained on the scene he'd witnessed outside. As he ate, Jesse found himself planning to take a walk around town after breakfast. It was perfectly natural for a traveler to want to stretch his legs and see the sights after all. If his wanderings happened to take him past the bank where Rose Hartwell was conducting her business, well, that was just coincidence. An hour later, Jesse strolled down the main street with the seemingly casual air of a man with time on his hands. His trained eyes, however, were constantly alert for signs of trouble. Years of staying one step ahead of bounty hunters had taught him to read the subtle signs that marked a town in distress. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. People stood in small groups, speaking in hushed, worried tones. Several shop owners kept glancing nervously toward the outskirts of town. The overall atmosphere was one of barely controlled fear, as if the entire community was holding its breath, waiting for something bad to happen. Jesse was pondering these observations when he heard the sound of raised voices coming from the alley beside the general store. Moving quietly, he positioned himself where he could see without being easily noticed. 3 men had cornered Rose Hartwell against the side wall of the building. They were rough-looking characters, the kind Jesse had encountered many times in his outlaw career, hired guns who sold their services to whoever could pay their price. The man in the center was tall and thin, with pale eyes and a cruel mouth. His companions flanked him like hunting wolves, ready to follow their leader's commands. "Now, Miss Hartwell," the thin man was saying in a voice like oil on water, "you just need to convince your daddy to be reasonable. Mr. Blackwood is making a generous offer for that ranch of yours. It would be a shame if something unfortunate happened because your family was too stubborn to accept good business advice." Rose's chin lifted defiantly, her green eyes flashing with anger rather than fear. "My father will never sell to Cyrus Blackwood, Mr. Slade. That ranch is our home, and we won't be intimidated by threats from hired thugs." So that was it, Jesse thought grimly. A land grab, the same kind of corrupt scheme that had destroyed his own family. Cyrus Blackwood was a name he'd heard whispered in saloons and trading posts throughout the territory, a wealthy and ruthless man who used violence and intimidation to build his empire. "Now that's not very friendly, miss," Slade continued, stepping closer to Rose. "Mr. Blackwood really doesn't like to take no for an answer. Maybe you need some convincing about the benefits of cooperation." One of Slade's companions reached out to grab Rose's arm, and that was when Jesse decided he'd seen enough. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Jesse said, stepping into the alley with his hands resting casually on his gun handles. His voice was soft and polite, but there was something in his tone that made all 3 men freeze. "I couldn't help but notice that the lady seems uncomfortable with your conversation." Slade turned to face this unexpected interruption, his pale eyes taking in Jesse's appearance with the calculating gaze of a professional killer. Jesse could almost see the man's mental wheels turning, trying to decide if this newcomer represented a serious threat or just another cowboy with more courage than sense. "This is a private conversation, friend," Slade said finally. "I'd suggest you move along before you get involved in something that's none of your business." "See, that's where you're wrong," Jesse replied, his voice remaining deceptively calm. "When 3 grown men corner a lady and start making threats, that becomes everybody's business. Especially mine." Rose watched this exchange with wide eyes, surprised by the intervention of a stranger. She'd seen this dark-haired man around town, had even caught him looking at her from his window at the saloon. Now he was risking his own safety to help her, and she found herself studying his face with new interest. There was strength in his features, she realized, not just physical strength, though his lean build clearly concealed considerable power, but a deeper kind of strength that came from facing difficult situations and surviving them. His eyes, she noticed, never stopped moving, constantly aware of his surroundings in a way that spoke of experience with danger. "You know what I think?" Slade said, his hand moving toward his gun. "I think you're about to learn why it's smart to mind your own business in this part of the country." What happened next took place so quickly that Rose barely had time to gasp. Slade's hand had barely touched his gun when Jesse moved, drawing both pistols in a motion so fluid and fast it seemed like magic. Before Slade and his companions could clear leather, they found themselves staring down the barrels of 2 pearl-handled Colts. "I think," Jesse said quietly, That you gentlemen should apologize to the lady and then find somewhere else to conduct your business." The three men stared at the guns pointed at their chests, their faces pale with the sudden realization that they'd confronted someone far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. Slade, to his credit, recovered his composure quickly, though his hand remained well clear of his weapon. "This isn't over," he said, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't forget when people interfere with his business." "Neither do I," Jesse replied, his tone carrying a promise of violence that made all three men take an involuntary step backward. As the gunman retreated from the alley, Jesse holstered his weapons with the same fluid motion he'd used to draw them. Only then did he turn his attention to Rose, who was studying him with an expression of gratitude mixed with curiosity. "Thank you," she said simply. "Those men have been harassing my family for weeks, but no one's been willing to stand up to them before." "Are you hurt?" Jesse asked, his eyes quickly checking her for any signs of injury. "No, they didn't touch me. But they would have if you hadn't come along." Rose extended her hand with the straightforward manner of someone raised to treat people as equals regardless of social position. "I'm Rose Hartwell." Jesse hesitated for just a moment before taking her offered hand. Her skin was soft but showed the calluses that came from ranch work, another indication of her practical nature. "Jake Morrison. I'm just passing through town." "Well, Mr. Morrison, you picked a good time to pass through." Rose's smile was warm and genuine, reaching her eyes in a way that made Jesse's carefully guarded heart skip a beat. "Can I buy you a cup of coffee? It's the least I can do to thank you for your help." Jesse knew he should decline. Getting involved with Rose Hartwell was dangerous for both of them, especially with men like Slade working for Cyrus Blackwood. But looking into her green eyes, seeing the grateful warmth in her expression, Jesse found his carefully maintained defenses beginning to crumble. "I'd like that," he heard himself saying. Rose led him to a small cafe next to the general store, a cozy establishment run by an elderly German couple who'd come west seeking their fortune in the gold fields but had found greater success feeding hungry travelers and locals. The cafe was warm and welcoming, with red-checkered tablecloths and the aroma of fresh-baked bread filling the air. As they settled at a corner table, Jesse found himself studying Rose more closely. Up close, he could see that her green eyes held flecks of gold that caught the light when she smiled. Her skin was lightly tanned from outdoor work, giving her a healthy glow that no amount of powder or paint could duplicate. When she spoke, her voice carried the cultured tones of education mixed with the straightforward honesty of frontier living. "So, Mr. Morrison," Rose said as Mrs. Mueller brought them steaming cups of coffee and slices of apple strudel, "what brings you to Copper Creek?" It was a simple question, but one that Jesse couldn't answer honestly without revealing his true identity. "Business," he said vaguely. "I travel around quite a bit looking for opportunities." "What kind of business?" Rose pressed gently, her intelligent eyes studying his face with obvious interest. Jesse found himself scrambling for a believable story. "Horses," he said finally. "I buy and sell horses. There's always a market for good breeding stock and trained riding animals." It wasn't entirely untrue. Jesse did know horses, and he traded in them from time to time when he needed to establish a legitimate cover story. Rose seemed to accept the explanation, nodding with understanding. "That makes sense. Good horses are always in demand out here. My father's always looking for quality animals to improve our breeding program." She paused to sip her coffee, then continued. "Those men you ran off, they work for a man named Cyrus Blackwood. He's been trying to buy up all the ranch land in this valley, and he doesn't take kindly to being told no." "Your father doesn't want to sell?" Rose's eyes flashed with determination. "The Hartwell Ranch is our home, Mr. Morrison. My parents came here with nothing and built something wonderful through hard work and sacrifice. My mother died 2 years ago, and keeping the ranch going is my way of honoring her memory and my father's dreams." Jesse found himself moved by the passion in her voice. Here was someone who understood the value of family and tradition, concepts that his outlaw lifestyle had forced him to abandon. "I can understand that," he said quietly. "Some things are worth fighting for." "Yes," Rose agreed, studying his face with new interest. "I think you do understand. There's something in your eyes that says you've fought for things that mattered to you." It was a perceptive observation, and Jesse realized that Rose Hartwell was more than just a pretty face. She had the kind of intuitive intelligence that saw beneath surface appearances to the truth underneath. It made her both more attractive and more dangerous to his carefully maintained secrets. "We all fight for something," Jesse said carefully. "The question is whether we're strong enough to win." Before Rose could respond to this cryptic statement, The cafe door opened with a bang that made several patrons jump. Sheriff Bradley entered, his face grim with concern. His experienced eyes quickly located Rose and Jesse at their corner table, and he approached with the measured stride of a man who'd learned to move carefully in potentially dangerous situations. "Miss Rose," the sheriff said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "I heard there was some trouble with Blackwood's men. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Sheriff Bradley, thanks to Mr. Morrison here." Rose gestured toward Jesse, who had instinctively tensed at the lawman's approach. "He convinced Slade and his friends to leave me alone." Sheriff Bradley's sharp eyes studied Jesse with renewed interest. "Did he now?" "That was mighty neighborly of you, Mr. Morrison. Most folks around here are scared to cross Blackwood's hired guns." "I don't like seeing women intimidated," Jesse replied evenly, meeting the sheriff's gaze without flinching. It seemed like the right thing to do. The sheriff nodded slowly, but Jesse could see questions forming behind the older man's eyes. Tom Bradley hadn't survived 20 years of frontier law enforcement by accepting things at face value, and Jesse's intervention in a dangerous situation was bound to raise suspicions about his background and capabilities. "Well, I appreciate you looking out for one of our leading citizens," Bradley said finally. "But I should warn you that standing up to Blackwood's men might make you a target yourself. These aren't the kind of people who forget when someone gets in their way." "I'll keep that in mind, Sheriff," Jesse replied. After Bradley left to continue his patrol of the town, Rose turned back to Jesse with obvious concern. "He's right, you know. Blackwood has a long reach and a longer memory. You might be in danger because you helped me." Jesse almost smiled at the irony of Rose Hartwell worrying about his safety. If she knew who he really was, she'd realize that danger was his constant companion, and that men like Slade represented just another day's work for someone with his background. "I can take care of myself," Jesse assured her. "But what about you and your father? If Blackwood is as ruthless as he seems, he won't give up just because I ran off 3 of his men." Rose's expression grew troubled. "I know. That's what worries me most. Papa's a proud man and he won't be intimidated into selling our ranch. But he's not as young as he used to be, and we can't fight an army of hired guns by ourselves." "You said Blackwood's been pressuring other ranchers too?" "Yes, but most of them have already sold out and moved on. The few who are left are too scared to stand together against him." Rose's hands tightened around her coffee cup as she spoke. "Blackwood's got the territorial governor in his pocket, and most of the law enforcement officials are either bought off or too intimidated to act. Sheriff Bradley's one of the few honest lawmen left, but he's just one man in a very small town." Jesse found himself genuinely angry on behalf of Rose and her father. The situation was all too familiar: corrupt wealthy men using violence and intimidation to steal from honest, hard-working people who couldn't fight back. It was exactly the kind of injustice that had driven him to become an outlaw in the first place. What if someone were to help even the odds? Jesse asked carefully. Rose looked at him with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if Blackwood's hired guns found out that there were people willing to fight back? Bullies usually back down when they realize their victims aren't helpless." "That's a dangerous way of thinking, Mr. Morrison," Rose said, though Jesse could see a spark of hope in her green eyes. "Good people could get hurt if they try to stand up to men like Blackwood." "Good people are already getting hurt," Jesse pointed out. "Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to show him that his victims are willing to fight back." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an older man who approached their table with obvious concern etched in his weathered features. Jesse recognized him immediately as the rancher he'd seen helping Rose into her wagon the previous evening. "Rose, honey," the man said, "I've been looking all over town for you. Mrs. Henderson said she saw you talking to some of Blackwood's men, and I was worried." He stopped short as he noticed Jesse sitting across from his daughter. "Papa, it's all right," Rose said quickly, rising to give her father a reassuring hug. "Mr. Morrison, I'd like you to meet my father, Marcus Hartwell." "Papa, this is Jake Morrison. He's the one who helped me when Slade and his men tried to intimidate me." Marcus Hartwell extended his hand to Jesse with the firm grip of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. He was in his mid-50s, Jesse judged, with silver-streaked brown hair and the kind of deep tan that came from decades of outdoor work. His blue eyes, so different from his daughter's green ones, held the wisdom and caution of someone who'd learned that life on the frontier could be both rewarding and dangerous. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus said gravely, "Rose told me what happened. I'm grateful for your help, but I'm also concerned about what it might mean for your own safety." "Your daughter expressed the same concern, Mr. Hartwell," Jesse replied. "I appreciate the warning, but I've dealt with men like Slade before." Marcus studied Jesse with the shrewd gaze of a successful rancher who'd learned to judge both horses and men. Have you now? You don't talk like most drifters who pass through these parts. There's something about you that suggests you've seen more than your share of trouble. It was another perceptive observation, and Jesse realized that both father and daughter shared the same ability to see beneath surface appearances. It made them formidable people, but it also made them dangerous to his carefully maintained cover story. I've been around, Jesse said simply. Well, Marcus said after a moment, anyone who's willing to stand up for my daughter is welcome at the Hartwell Ranch. Why don't you ride out with us this afternoon? Rose can show you some of our breeding stock and you can stay for supper. It's the least we can do to thank you for your help. Jesse knew he should decline the invitation. Getting closer to Rose and her father was dangerous for everyone involved. But the genuine warmth in Marcus's voice, combined with the hopeful look in Rose's eyes, made it impossible for him to refuse. I'd be honored, Mr. Hartwell, Jesse heard himself saying. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Jesse found himself wondering what he was getting into. For 7 years he'd lived by a simple rule: stay unattached, keep moving, and never let anyone get close enough to matter. Now, in the space of 2 days, he'd met a woman who made him question everything he thought he knew about his own limitations, and a family whose values reminded him of what he'd lost when he chose the outlaw's path. Outside, Marcus helped Rose mount her chestnut mare while Jesse retrieved Midnight from the saloon's hitching post. As they prepared to ride out to the Hartwell Ranch, Jesse caught sight of a familiar figure watching them from the doorway of the general store. Slade stood in the shadows, his pale eyes fixed on Jesse with unmistakable hatred. Even from a distance, Jesse could read the promise of violence in the gunman's posture. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As they rode out of Copper Creek toward the Hartwell Ranch, Jesse found himself riding beside Rose while her father led the way on a sturdy bay gelding. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber that took Jesse's breath away. It's beautiful country, Jesse commented, his trained eyes automatically cataloging the terrain for both its scenic value and its tactical advantages. I've never lived anywhere else, Rose replied, but I can't imagine any place more beautiful than this valley in the springtime. When I was back east at school, I used to dream about riding across these hills on mornings when the wildflowers were blooming and the grass was green from spring rain. Jesse found himself genuinely moved by the love for her homeland that colored Rose's voice. It reminded him of his own feelings for the Texas ranch where he'd grown up, before violence and loss had driven him to become a wanderer with no real home. As they rode deeper into the valley, Jesse could see why Marcus Hartwell had chosen this land for his ranch. The grass was rich and thick, perfect for grazing cattle. Several streams provided fresh water year-round, and the surrounding hills offered natural protection from the worst weather. It was the kind of place where a man could build something lasting, something to pass on to future generations. The Hartwell Ranch house came into view as they crested a small rise, and Jesse had to admit he was impressed. It wasn't the largest or most elaborate home he'd seen, but it had been built with care and attention to detail. The main house was constructed of local stone and timber, with a wide front porch that invited visitors to sit and enjoy the view of the surrounding valley. Several outbuildings, a barn, bunkhouse, and various utility structures, were arranged in a practical pattern that spoke of years of thoughtful planning. Papa designed and built most of it himself, Rose said, noticing Jesse's appreciative gaze. It took him nearly 10 years to get everything the way he wanted it, but he said he was building for the future, not just for today. Marcus had been listening to their conversation, and now he turned in his saddle to address Jesse directly. A ranch like this represents more than just property, Mr. Morrison. It's a legacy, something to pass on to children and grandchildren. That's why I'll never sell to Blackwood, no matter what he threatens. Jesse nodded, understanding completely. He'd grown up on a similar ranch, had watched his own father pour his heart and soul into building something permanent and good. The memory of what had been stolen from his family made his jaw tighten with old anger. As they approached the ranch buildings, several cowhands emerged from various work areas to greet their returning boss and his daughter. Jesse counted at least 6 men, all armed and alert. Marcus Hartwell was no fool when it came to protecting his property and family. "Boys," Marcus called out, "I want you to meet Jake Morrison. He helped Rose out of some trouble in town today, and he'll be staying for supper." The ranch hands nodded respectfully to Jesse, but he could see them sizing him up with the professional interest of men who might need to fight beside or against him someday. Jesse approved of their caution. It suggested that Marcus ran a tight, disciplined operation. After they'd unsaddled their horses and seen them properly cared for in the barn, Rose offered to show Jesse around the ranch while her father attended to some business with his foreman. As they walked through the well-maintained facilities, Jesse found himself impressed by the obvious prosperity and efficiency of the operation. "Your father's built something remarkable here," Jesse commented as they watched a group of prize cattle grazing in a nearby pasture. "He always said that if you're going to do something, you might as well do it right the first time," Rose replied with obvious pride. Some of the other ranchers thought he was crazy to invest so much in quality breeding stock and modern equipment, but it's paid off. "We produce some of the finest beef in the territory." Jesse nodded, his experienced eye recognizing the truth of her words. The Hartwell cattle were indeed superior animals, well-fed, healthy, and clearly the result of careful breeding programs. It was exactly the kind of successful operation that would attract the attention of someone like Cyrus Blackwood. "Tell me about Blackwood," Jesse said as they continued their tour. "How long has he been pressuring ranchers in this area?" Rose's expression grew troubled. "About 2 years now. He showed up with enough money to buy out several of the smaller ranchers, and those who wouldn't sell voluntarily found themselves facing all kinds of problems. Mysterious cattle deaths, fences cut, water sources poisoned, the kind of things that can destroy a ranch if they happen often enough. And the law doesn't do anything? Sheriff Bradley tries, but he's just one man with jurisdiction over a huge area. By the time he investigates one incident, 3 more have happened elsewhere. Besides, Blackwood's smart enough to cover his tracks. He never leaves evidence that would stand up in court." Jesse found himself thinking about the tactical situation from both sides. Blackwood was using classic intimidation techniques, applying pressure gradually while maintaining plausible deniability. It was an effective strategy against isolated targets who couldn't coordinate their defense. "What about the other ranchers who are still holding out?" Jesse asked. "Have you tried organizing some kind of mutual defense?" Rose sighed. "Papa's tried, but most of the others are too scared to work together. They figure if they keep their heads down and don't make trouble, maybe Blackwood will leave them alone." "That's not how men like Blackwood operate," Jesse observed grimly. "Showing weakness just encourages them to apply more pressure." "I know that, and Papa knows it too. But convincing scared people to stand up and fight isn't easy when they have families to protect." As they talked, Jesse found himself studying Rose with growing admiration. She clearly understood the strategic situation her family faced, and she wasn't naive about the dangers involved. Yet she remained determined to fight for what was theirs, even against overwhelming odds. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Marcus appeared around the corner of the barn, riding hard and looking grim. Behind him came his foreman, a weathered man in his 40s whose expression suggested bad news. "Rose," Marcus called out as he dismounted, "we've got trouble. Tom Bradley just rode out to tell us that the Williamson place was hit last night. Barn burned, 20 head of cattle shot, and old Jim's in town with a bullet in his shoulder." Rose's face went pale. "Is he going to be all right?" "Doc says he'll live, but he's finished as a rancher. He's already told Blackwood he'll sell for whatever price is offered." Jesse felt his anger rising at this latest example of Blackwood's tactics. Attacking an elderly rancher and destroying his livelihood was the act of a coward who used violence against those who couldn't fight back effectively. "Did anyone see who did it?" Jesse asked. Marcus shook his head. "Jim was knocked unconscious during the attack. By the time he came to, his barn was burning and the attackers were long gone. But we all know who was behind it." "This has to stop," Rose said, her voice tight with anger. "We can't just keep letting Blackwood pick us off one by one." "I agree," Marcus replied, "but I'm not sure what we can do about it. The law's useless and we don't have enough men to patrol every ranch in the valley." Jesse found himself at a crossroads. Every instinct developed over 7 years as an outlaw told him to stay out of this fight, to collect his horse and ride away before he became more deeply involved. But looking at Rose's determined face and Marcus's obvious frustration, he realized he couldn't just walk away. "What if you had some help?" Jesse said quietly. "Someone with experience in dealing with men like Blackwood's hired guns?" Both Marcus and Rose stared at him with surprise. "What kind of help?" Marcus asked cautiously. "The kind that evens the odds," Jesse replied. "Blackwood's strategy depends on his victims being helpless. Take away that advantage and he might decide it's easier to find targets somewhere else." Marcus studied Jesse with new intensity. "You're talking about fighting fire with fire? That's a dangerous game, Mr. Morrison. Are you sure you know what you're getting into?" Jesse met the older man's gaze steadily. "I know exactly what I'm getting into, Mr. Hartwell. The question is whether you're willing to accept help from someone whose methods might not always be strictly legal. It was as close as Jesse dared come to revealing his true nature without actually admitting to being an outlaw. He watched as Marcus and Rose exchanged a long look, clearly communicating without words in the way that close families often did. Finally Marcus spoke. "Mr. Morrison, I've spent my whole life trying to be an honest, law-abiding citizen. But when the law can't or won't protect good people from evil ones, maybe it's time to consider other options." "Papa," Rose said softly, "are you sure about this?" Marcus looked at his daughter with deep love and concern. "Rose, your mother and I didn't build this ranch so we could lose it to a pack of wolves in expensive suits. If Mr. Morrison has ideas about how we can fight back, I'm willing to listen." Jesse felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the responsibility that came with using his skills to help others. It was a burden he'd carried many times before, and one that had cost him dearly on more than one occasion. But looking at Rose's hopeful face, he knew he couldn't walk away. "All right," Jesse said, "here's what I propose." That evening, as they sat around the Hartwell family's dinner table, Jesse found himself experiencing something he'd almost forgotten, the warmth of being part of a family, even temporarily. Rose had prepared a magnificent meal of roasted beef, fresh vegetables from the ranch's garden, and apple pie that rivaled anything he'd tasted in the finest restaurants of San Francisco or Denver. The conversation flowed easily, covering everything from ranch operations to Rose's experiences at the prestigious ladies' academy she'd attended back east. Jesse was careful to keep his own contributions vague, maintaining his cover as a traveling horse trader while gradually revealing enough knowledge about tactics and strategy to establish his credibility as someone who could help in their fight against Blackwood. "You know," Marcus said as Rose served generous slices of pie, "you don't talk like most horse traders I've met. There's something about the way you analyze situations that reminds me of military men I knew during the war between the states." Jesse felt a moment of tension. Marcus Hartwell was clearly more perceptive than he'd initially appeared, and getting too specific about his background could lead to dangerous questions. "I've had some experience with strategic thinking," Jesse said carefully. "When you're dealing with valuable animals and large sums of money, you learn to think like the people who might want to take them from you." It wasn't entirely untrue. Jesse's years as an outlaw had indeed taught him to think strategically about both sides of criminal activities. He'd learned to anticipate law enforcement tactics, plan complex operations, and read the motivations of everyone from corrupt politicians to desperate ranchers. Rose leaned forward with interest. "So what do you think Blackwood's next move will be?" Jesse considered the question seriously, drawing on his knowledge of how ruthless men operated. "He's following a predictable pattern. First, he tries to buy people out with reasonable offers. When that doesn't work, he applies increasing pressure through intimidation and sabotage. The attack on the Williamson Ranch was designed to send a message to everyone else in the valley." "What message?" Marcus asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "That the cost of resistance is higher than the cost of surrender," Jesse replied grimly. "He's showing everyone what happens to people who don't accept his generous offers." Rose's green eyes flashed with anger. "So he's basically terrorizing innocent families into giving up everything they've worked for." "That's exactly what he's doing," Jesse confirmed. "And it's a very effective strategy, especially when his targets are isolated and can't coordinate their defense." Marcus set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "All right, Mr. Morrison. You've identified the problem accurately enough. Now what's your solution?" Jesse had been thinking about this question all afternoon, weighing various approaches against the risks and resources available. "The key is to change the cost-benefit calculation," he said finally. "Right now, Blackwood sees easy targets who can be intimidated without significant risk to himself or his operations. We need to make him understand that continuing his campaign will cost him more than he's willing to pay." "How do we do that?" Rose asked. "By hitting back in ways he doesn't expect," Jesse replied. "Blackwood's using hired guns because he wants to maintain distance from the violence. He presents himself as a legitimate businessman while others do his dirty work. We need to make that strategy uncomfortable for him." Marcus nodded slowly. "You're talking about taking the fight directly to Blackwood instead of just defending our own properties." "Exactly. Defensive strategies rarely work against determined aggressors. You have to make them worried about their own vulnerabilities." Rose looked troubled by the direction of their conversation. "That sounds like you're talking about becoming outlaws ourselves. Is that really the only way?" Jesse felt the irony of her question like a physical weight. Here he was, an actual outlaw with a bounty on his head, advising a rancher's daughter about the moral implications of fighting back against injustice. Sometimes, he said carefully, the line between justice and lawlessness gets blurred. The question is whether you can live with the choices you make. I can live with anything except losing our ranch to that snake, Marcus said firmly. What did you have in mind? Over the next hour, Jesse outlined a plan that drew on his years of experience planning and executing complex operations. The key was to strike at Blackwood's interest in ways that would be difficult to trace back to the remaining ranchers, while simultaneously demonstrating that continued aggression would be costly. Blackwood's got interests beyond just acquiring ranch land, Jesse explained. He owns freight companies, mining operations, and various other businesses throughout the territory. Those enterprises depend on predictable operations and secure supply lines. You want to disrupt his other businesses? Rose asked. I want to make him understand that escalating the conflict will hurt him more than it helps him, Jesse clarified. If his freight wagons start having mysterious accidents, if his mining equipment develops persistent mechanical problems, if his supply lines become unreliable, eventually he'll decide that buying ranch land at fair prices is cheaper than dealing with an endless series of costly disruptions. Marcus was studying Jesse with obvious admiration. That's actually brilliant. Instead of trying to match his hired guns with our own, we make the whole enterprise unprofitable for him. But how do we actually do these things without getting caught? Rose asked practically. We're ranchers, not whatever kind of people are skilled at sabotage and disruption. Jesse met her gaze steadily. That's where I come in. I have experience with these kinds of operations. The admission hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that none of them wanted to examine too closely. Marcus and Rose were intelligent people. They had to suspect that Jesse's mysterious background and unusual skills suggested a past that wasn't entirely legitimate. But they were also desperate people facing an enemy who wouldn't hesitate to destroy them. Finally, Marcus spoke. Mr. Morrison, I don't know who you really are or what you've done in your past. What I do know is that you helped my daughter when she was in trouble, you've shown nothing but respect for our family, and you're offering to risk your own safety to help us fight for our home. That's enough for me. Rose nodded agreement. Papa's right. We can't afford to be particular about where help comes from when we're fighting for our lives. Jesse felt a complex mixture of emotions at their acceptance. Part of him was grateful for their trust, but another part worried about the danger his involvement might bring to them. If his true identity were discovered, it could destroy everything they'd worked to build. There are risks, Jesse warned them. If things go wrong, if I'm recognized or caught, it could bring trouble down on both of you. We're already in trouble, Rose pointed out. At least this way we're fighting back instead of just waiting to be destroyed. Over the next 2 hours, they refined the plan and discussed logistics. Jesse would remain in Copper Creek for several more days, ostensibly continuing his horse trading business while actually gathering intelligence on Blackwood's operations and identifying vulnerable targets. Meanwhile, Marcus would quietly reach out to the few remaining independent ranchers, feeling out their willingness to support a more aggressive resistance. The key is to keep everything compartmentalized, Jesse emphasized. The fewer people who know the full scope of what we're doing, the safer everyone will be. As the evening drew to a close, Rose walked with Jesse to the barn where Midnight was stabled. The night air was cool and clear, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Mr. Morrison, Rose said quietly, can I ask you something personal? Jesse felt his defenses rising, but he nodded for her to continue. When you helped me today, when you drew those guns on Slade and his men, I've never seen anyone move that fast. That kind of skill doesn't come from casual practice. Who are you really? Jesse stared up at the star-filled sky, wrestling with how much truth he dared reveal. I'm someone who's made mistakes in his past, he said finally. Someone who's trying to make amends by helping good people fight against injustice. Rose studied his profile in the moonlight, seeing the pain and regret that he tried so hard to conceal. We all make mistakes, she said softly. What matters is what we do afterward to make things right. Jesse turned to look at her, struck by the wisdom and compassion in her voice. In the silvery moonlight, she looked ethereally beautiful, but it was the strength and understanding in her green eyes that took his breath away. You're a remarkable woman, Rose Hartwell, he said quietly. And you're a mysterious man, Jake Morrison, she replied with a slight smile. But I think you're a good man, regardless of whatever shadows you're carrying from your past. For a moment, they stood close together in the moonlight, both aware of the growing attraction between them but uncertain how to navigate the dangerous waters of their situation. Jesse knew he should step back, should maintain the distance that his lifestyle required. But Rose's presence was like a beacon of hope in the darkness that had surrounded his life for so many years. "Rose," he said softly, "I'm not the kind of man who can offer you the future you deserve." "Maybe," she replied, moving slightly closer, "but you're the kind of man who's willing to risk everything to help strangers fight for what's right. That says more about your character than any number of past mistakes." Before Jesse could respond, the sound of approaching horses shattered the intimate moment. Both of them tensed, hands moving instinctively toward weapons as the sound of multiple riders approached the ranch at high speed. "Rose, get to the house." Marcus's voice boomed from the direction of the main building. Jesse drew both guns in the fluid motion that had become second nature, positioning himself between Rose and the approaching threat. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to life-or-death situations. The riders came into view as they crested the small hill leading to the ranch buildings. 6 men on horseback, riding hard and spread out in the tactical formation favored by experienced gunfighters. Even in the moonlight, Jesse could make out enough details to confirm his worst fears. Slade rode at the center of the group, his pale eyes gleaming with malicious anticipation. The men flanking him were all cut from the same cloth, professional killers who sold their services to the highest bidder. They were armed with rifles as well as handguns, and they approached the ranch with the confidence of men who'd done this kind of work many times before. "Hartwell?" Slade called out as the riders pulled up in the ranch yard. "We need to talk." Marcus appeared on his front porch, holding a shotgun with the easy familiarity of a man who knew how to use it. Several of his ranch hands emerged from the bunkhouse, also armed and ready for trouble. "It's past decent hours for social calls, Slade," Marcus replied calmly. "State your business and get off my land." Slade's cruel laugh echoed across the ranch yard. "My business is with your friend there, the one who thinks he's fast with a gun." Jesse stepped out of the shadows beside the barn, his weapons held ready but not quite aimed. "I'm right here, Slade. What's on your mind?" "What's on my mind," Slade replied, "is that Mr. Blackwood doesn't like interference in his business dealings. He's decided to make an example of people who don't know their place." "Seems to me," Jesse observed, "that your boss makes a lot of threats for someone who hides behind hired guns. If he's got something to say to me, maybe he should come say it himself." The insult hit home as Jesse had intended. Several of Slade's men shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. The tension in the ranch yard was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Mr. Blackwood has better things to do than waste time on drifting gunfighters," Slade replied. "But he did ask me to deliver a message." "I'm listening," Jesse said. "The message is this: pack up your gear and ride out of Copper Creek tonight. If you're still in the territory come morning, we'll assume you want to dance and we'll be happy to provide the music." Jesse felt the familiar coldness settling over him, the mental state he'd learned to cultivate when violence was inevitable. Around him, he could sense Marcus and his ranch hands preparing for a fight, while Rose remained hidden behind the barn where he'd ordered her to stay. "Here's my message for your boss," Jesse said, his voice carrying across the yard with deadly calm. "Tell him that Jake Morrison doesn't run from cowards who threaten women and burn out old men. If he wants me gone, he's welcome to try removing me himself." Slade's face twisted with rage. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Morrison." "No," Jesse replied quietly, "my biggest mistake was letting you ride away this afternoon. I won't make that error twice." For a heartbeat, the entire ranch yard was frozen in tense silence. Then Slade went for his gun, and hell erupted in the Arizona moonlight. What happened next would be talked about in saloons and bunkhouses throughout Arizona territory for years to come. Jesse's gun seemed to appear in his hands like magic, spitting fire and thunder before any of Slade's men had cleared leather. His first 2 shots took down the riders on Slade's flanks, punching them backward out of their saddles with the devastating accuracy of a man who'd spent years perfecting his deadly craft. Marcus Hartwell's shotgun roared from the porch, the spread of buckshot catching another of Blackwood's hired guns and spinning him around like a child's toy. The ranch hands, following their boss's lead, opened fire from positions of cover around the yard, their weapons adding to the hellish cacophony of battle. Slade himself managed to get his gun clear and fired at Jesse, the bullet passing so close to the outlaw's head that it singed his hair. Jesse's return shot was more accurate, catching Slade in the shoulder and spinning him around in his saddle. The pale-eyed gunman cursed viciously as he struggled to maintain his seat on his panicking horse. The remaining attackers, realizing they'd ridden into a trap rather than the easy intimidation they'd expected, began firing wildly while trying to control their horses and retreat at the same time. Bullets flew in all directions, shattering windows in the ranch house and splintering the wooden walls of outbuildings. Jesse rolled behind a water trough as bullets whined overhead, his mind automatically calculating angles and distances with the precision of a mathematician. When one of the gunmen turned his horse to get a better shot, Jesse rose smoothly from cover and put 2 rounds center mass, ending the threat with clinical efficiency. The gunfight lasted less than 2 minutes, but in that brief time the peaceful ranch yard was transformed into a scene from a war zone. When the smoke finally cleared, 4 of Blackwood's hired guns lay motionless in the dirt, while Slade and one companion were retreating toward the hills, both wounded and clearly having lost their appetite for further combat. "Anyone hurt?" Marcus called out, emerging from the porch with his shotgun still ready. "Couple scratches, nothing serious," replied Jake Wilson, the ranch foreman. "How about you, boss?" "I'm fine," Marcus said, then looked toward the barn where Jesse was already checking on Rose. "What about our guests?" Rose emerged from behind the barn, shaken but uninjured. "I'm all right," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Mr. Morrison made sure I stayed out of the line of fire." Jesse was reloading his guns with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd learned never to be caught with empty weapons. His face was grim as he surveyed the aftermath of the battle. 4 men were dead, and while they'd been trying to kill him and his friends, Jesse took no pleasure in the necessity of violence. "They'll be back," Jesse said quietly. "Probably with more men, and they'll be more careful next time." Marcus nodded grimly. "Then we'd better be ready for them. Jake, get the boys to help you drag these bodies into town. Sheriff Bradley needs to see what we're dealing with." As the ranch hands began the grim task of loading the dead gunman onto a wagon, Rose approached Jesse with concern written in her green eyes. "Are you hurt?" she asked, reaching out to touch a tear in his shirt sleeve where a bullet had passed close enough to graze the fabric. "I'm fine," Jesse assured her, though he was acutely aware of her gentle touch. "But your father's right. This is just the beginning. Blackwood will see this as a declaration of war." "Good," Rose said with surprising fierceness. "Maybe it's time someone declared war on him." Jesse studied her face in the moonlight, seeing the courage and determination that made her so remarkable. But he also saw the innocence that war would inevitably destroy, and he felt a pang of regret for his role in bringing violence to her doorstep. "War changes people," he said softly. "Sometimes in ways they can never undo. So does letting evil triumph without a fight," Rose replied. "My mother used to say that good people have a responsibility to stand up against injustice, even when it's dangerous." Before Jesse could respond, Sheriff Bradley rode into the ranch yard at the head of a small posse. The lawman's face was grim as he surveyed the scene of carnage, his experienced eyes taking in details that would help him understand what had happened. "Marcus," the sheriff said, dismounting near the porch, "we heard gunfire from town. What happened here?" Marcus quickly explained the evening's events, with Jesse adding occasional details about the tactical situation. Sheriff Bradley listened without interruption, his weathered face growing increasingly troubled as the story unfolded. "Slade and his boys came here looking for a fight," Bradley summarized when they finished. "You defended your property and your guests. Under territorial law, you were within your rights. But," Jesse prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation in the sheriff's voice. "But Cyrus Blackwood isn't going to see it that way," Bradley replied grimly. "He's got enough money and political influence to make life very difficult for anyone who crosses him. Killing 4 of his hired guns is going to make you a marked man, Mr. Morrison." "I was already a marked man," Jesse pointed out. "At least now Blackwood knows the cost of sending gunfighters after innocent people." Sheriff Bradley studied Jesse with the sharp eyes of a man who'd spent decades judging character and reading danger. "You're not what you seem, are you, Morrison? That display of gun work I just heard described, that's not the skill level of a traveling horse trader." Jesse felt the familiar tension that came with official scrutiny, but he met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "I'm a man who's learned to protect himself and others when the need arises, Sheriff. Nothing more, nothing less." It wasn't a complete answer and everyone present knew it. But Sheriff Bradley nodded slowly, apparently deciding that some questions were better left unasked. "Well," the sheriff said finally, "whatever your background, you helped defend honest folks against hired killers. That counts for something in my book." He paused, then continued in a more serious tone. "But I have to warn all of you, this isn't over. Blackwood's not going to let this slide, and next time he'll come with overwhelming force." "What do you suggest we do?" Marcus asked. "Legally?" I suggest you sell out and leave the territory before more people get killed. Bradley's expression showed how much he hated giving that advice. Practically? I suggest you get ready for a war because that's what's coming. After the sheriff and his posse left with the bodies of the dead gunmen, Jesse found himself alone with Marcus on the ranch house porch. Rose had gone inside to prepare coffee and tend to the minor wounds suffered by some of the ranch hands during the fight. Mr. Morrison, Marcus said quietly, I want you to know that what happened tonight doesn't change my opinion of you. If anything, it confirms that we chose the right ally. I brought this trouble to your doorstep, Jesse replied, staring out at the moonlit valley. If I hadn't gotten involved, Slade might have contented himself with threats. Marcus shook his head. Slade came here to deliver a message from Blackwood, and that message was going to be the same whether you were here or not. Submit or be destroyed. At least now Blackwood knows we're not going to be easy victims. Jesse appreciated the older man's perspective, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his presence had escalated a situation that might have been resolved with less violence. It was a familiar burden, the knowledge that his reputation and skills often made conflicts deadlier than they might otherwise have been. After the sheriff and his posse left with the bodies of the dead gunmen, Jesse found himself alone with Marcus on the ranch house porch. Rose had gone inside to prepare coffee and tend to the minor wounds suffered by some of the ranch hands during the fight. Mr. Morrison, Marcus said quietly, I want you to know that what happened tonight doesn't change my opinion of you. If anything, it confirms that we chose the right ally. I brought this trouble to your doorstep, Jesse replied, staring out at the moonlit valley. If I hadn't gotten involved, Slade might have contented himself with threats. Marcus shook his head. Slade came here to deliver a message from Blackwood, and that message was going to be the same whether you were here or not. Submit or be destroyed. At least now Blackwood knows we're not going to be easy victims. Jesse appreciated the older man's perspective, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his presence had escalated a situation that might have been resolved with less violence. It was a familiar burden, the knowledge that his reputation and skills often made conflicts deadlier than they might otherwise have been. What you did tonight, Marcus continued, took courage and skill that don't come from trading horses. I don't know who you really are and I'm not going to ask. But I want you to know that whatever brought you to Copper Creek, I'm grateful it happened. Rose emerged from the house carrying a tray with coffee and sandwiches, her practical nature asserting itself even in the aftermath of violence. As she served the men, Jesse found himself studying her face, looking for signs of the trauma that such events often left behind. But Rose Hartwell was made of stronger stuff than most. While she was clearly shaken by the violence she'd witnessed, there was no fear in her green eyes, only determination and a growing resolve to see the fight through to its conclusion. I've been thinking, she said as they sat in the moonlight, about what comes next. What do you mean? Jesse asked. I mean that tonight proved we can stand up to Blackwood's hired guns. But Sheriff Bradley was right. Next time they'll come with overwhelming force. We need to change the nature of the game before that happens. Marcus looked at his daughter with obvious pride. What are you suggesting, honey? I'm suggesting we stop playing defense and start taking the fight to Blackwood himself, Rose replied firmly. We need to make him understand that continuing this war will cost him more than he's willing to pay. Jesse felt a mixture of admiration and concern at her words. Rose was showing the kind of strategic thinking that could win wars, but she was also talking about crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. That's a dangerous path, Jesse warned her. Once you start down that road, it's hard to turn back. And once Blackwood starts murdering innocent ranchers, it's hard to pretend that playing by the rules will save us, Rose countered. Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. Over the next hour, they refined their earlier plans in light of the evening's events. The attack on the ranch had eliminated any possibility of a peaceful resolution. Now it was a matter of survival for everyone who opposed Blackwood's expansion into the valley. Jesse outlined several potential targets among Blackwood's business interests, ranging from supply wagons to mining operations. The key was to strike quickly and decisively, inflicting maximum economic damage while maintaining plausible deniability. We'll need to move fast, Jesse explained. Once Blackwood realizes what we're doing, he'll take steps to protect his more vulnerable operations. How soon can we start? Marcus asked. Tomorrow night, Jesse replied. There's a freight wagon carrying mining equipment to one of Blackwood's claims up in the mountains. If that wagon were to experience mechanical difficulties in a remote location, it would send the right kind of message. Rose leaned forward with interest. What kind of mechanical difficulties? Jesse's smile was cold and professional. The kind that turn expensive mining equipment into scrap metal. As they finalized their plans, Jesse found himself thinking about the path that had brought him to this point. 7 years ago, he'd been a 15-year-old boy seeking vengeance for his murdered parents. Now he was a 28-year-old outlaw helping a rancher's family fight for their home and their lives. The irony wasn't lost on him. In seeking justice for his own family, he'd become the very thing that people like the Hartwells feared. A man who lived outside the law, who solved problems with violence, who brought danger wherever he went. But looking at Rose's determined face and Marcus's stubborn courage, Jesse realized that maybe his outlaw skills could be used for something better than personal vengeance. Maybe he could help good people fight against the kind of corruption and violence that had destroyed his own family. It was a dangerous hope, and Jesse had learned not to trust hope too completely. But as he sat on the Hartwell Ranch porch under the Arizona stars, planning their war against Cyrus Blackwood, he allowed himself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, even an outlaw could find redemption in fighting for justice. The question was whether he could keep Rose and Marcus safe while waging that fight, or whether his presence would ultimately bring about their destruction as surely as it had brought violence to their peaceful ranch. Only time would tell, but Jesse McKenna, alias Jake Morrison, was determined to give them the best chance possible, even if it cost him his life in the process. The next evening found Jesse crouched behind a boulder on a mountainous trail 20 miles north of Copper Creek, watching a freight wagon make its slow progress up the winding mountain path. The wagon was heavily loaded with mining equipment destined for one of Blackwood's silver claims: hydraulic pumps, steam engines, and specialized drilling equipment that represented a significant investment. Jesse had been in position for over an hour, studying the wagon's escort and planning his approach. As expected, Blackwood had assigned guards to protect his valuable cargo, 4 armed men who rode with the alert professionalism of experienced fighters. They weren't taking any chances after the previous night's violence at the Hartwell Ranch. But Jesse had advantages that the guards didn't know about. He knew this mountain trail like the back of his hand, having used it several times during his outlaw career to evade pursuing lawmen. More importantly, he was fighting alone, which gave him the element of surprise and the flexibility to adapt his tactics as the situation developed. As the wagon approached a narrow section of the trail where high rock walls rose on both sides, Jesse made his move. He'd spent the afternoon preparing this location, loosening several large boulders above the trail and rigging them with ropes so they could be brought down with a single pull. The wagon was directly beneath his position when Jesse yanked the rope. Half a ton of rock crashed down onto the trail behind the wagon, effectively blocking any retreat while creating enough noise and confusion to panic both the horses and their human companions. "What the hell?" one of the guards shouted, fighting to control his rearing horse. Jesse's voice echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Drop your weapons and ride away. This is your only warning." The guards spun in their saddles, trying to locate the source of the voice while keeping their mounts under control. The wagon driver was having his own problems. His team of draft horses was spooked by the rockslide and threatening to bolt despite the heavy load they were pulling. "Show yourself, you coward," one of the guards called out, his rifle ready but lacking a target. Jesse's answer came in the form of a carefully aimed shot that knocked the hat off the man's head without touching his hair. The message was clear: "I can hit whatever I aim at, so don't test me." "Next shot won't be a warning," Jesse's voice echoed again. "Leave the wagon and ride out. You've got 30 seconds to decide." The guards exchanged nervous glances. These were professional fighters, but they were also practical men who understood when they were outmatched. Fighting an invisible enemy in terrain that favored him was a losing proposition, especially when their primary job was to protect cargo, not engage in heroics. "Let's go," the lead guard finally decided. "This job doesn't pay enough to get killed over." As the 4 guards spurred their horses back down the trail, Jesse emerged from his concealment and approached the abandoned wagon. The driver, an elderly man who'd clearly been hired for his skill with horses rather than his fighting ability, sat frozen on his bench seat. "Don't hurt me, mister," the old man pleaded. "I'm just trying to make an honest living." "I'm not going to hurt you," Jesse assured him, his voice gentle now that the guards were gone. "In fact, I'm going to do you a favor." Jesse reached into his vest and pulled out a roll of bills, part of the money he'd taken from a corrupt railroad payroll several months earlier. He peeled off enough to represent several months' wages for a freight driver. "This should cover your losses and then some," Jesse said, handing the money to the startled driver. "Tell Blackwood that his cargo experienced mechanical difficulties in a remote location. Tell him that these kinds of accidents will keep happening as long as he continues his war against honest ranchers." The driver stared at the money in amazement. "You're paying me? But you're stealing the cargo?" I'm redistributing wealth from someone who has too much to someone who has too little, Jesse corrected. There's a difference. After the driver had unhitched his horses and ridden away, Jesse said about the systematic destruction of Blackwood's mining equipment. Using dynamite he'd acquired during his outlaw career, he reduced thousands of dollars worth of machinery to twisted metal and broken parts. The explosion echoed through the mountains like thunder, sending a message that would be heard all the way to Blackwood's luxurious offices in Tucson. The war between the ranchers and the land grabber had entered a new phase. As Jesse rode midnight back toward Copper Creek, he reflected on the night's work. It had been a clean operation. No one had been hurt, the innocent driver had been compensated for his troubles, and Blackwood had suffered a significant financial loss. More importantly, the attack had demonstrated that the railroad baron's operations were vulnerable to someone with the right skills and motivation. But Jesse also knew that Blackwood wouldn't take this escalation lightly. The man hadn't built his empire by backing down from challenges, and losing valuable equipment would only make him more determined to crush all resistance in the valley. The next morning, news of the destroyed freight wagon spread through Copper Creek like wildfire. Jesse, maintaining his cover as Jake Morrison the horse trader, listened to the excited conversations in the saloon with carefully concealed satisfaction. They say it was like a ghost done it, Bill Thompson was telling a group of fascinated customers. Appeared out of nowhere, ran off 4 armed guards without firing a shot at them, then blew up $50,000 worth of mining equipment and disappeared into thin air. Had to be more than one man, argued Sam Mueller from the cafe. No single person could pull off something like that. Sheriff Bradley entered the saloon at that moment, his weathered face grim with concern. The conversations died down as the lawman approached the bar, clearly carrying news that no one wanted to hear. Bill, the sheriff said quietly, I need to talk to everyone here about what happened up in the mountains last night. What about it, Tom? Bill asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Cyrus Blackwood rode into town this morning with 20 hired guns, Bradley replied. He's madder than a rattlesnake, and he's convinced that the ranchers in this valley are behind the attack on his freight wagon. Jesse felt his muscles tense, but he kept his expression neutral as he nursed his morning whiskey. Around him, he could hear the nervous murmurs of men who suddenly realized that their small conflict had escalated beyond their ability to control. What's he planning to do about it? Someone asked. He's demanding that I arrest Marcus Hartwell and anyone else who might have been involved, Bradley continued. Says he's got evidence that proves the ranchers are organizing some kind of vigilante campaign against his legitimate business interests. What kind of evidence? Bill pressed. The kind that money can buy, Bradley replied grimly. Witness statements, suspicious activities, connections between yesterday's gunfight at the Hartwell Ranch and last night's attack on the freight wagon. Jesse realized that Blackwood was moving faster than they'd anticipated. By connecting the destruction of his equipment to the ranchers, he was creating justification for massive retaliation against anyone who opposed him. You going to arrest Marcus? Bill asked. Sheriff Bradley was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with a difficult decision. I've known Marcus Hartwell for 15 years, he said finally. He's one of the most honest men I've ever met. But I'm just one sheriff with limited jurisdiction, and Blackwood's got territorial officials breathing down my neck. So that's a yes? Jesse asked quietly. Bradley turned to look at him with troubled eyes. I don't have much choice, unless someone can give me a better alternative. Jesse finished his whiskey and stood up, his mind already working on the implications of this development. If Marcus was arrested, the Hartwell Ranch would be left defenseless against Blackwood's hired guns. Rose would be alone and vulnerable, and the other ranchers would lose their strongest leader. Sheriff, Jesse said carefully, what if the real person responsible for last night's attack came forward? Would that change things? Bradley studied him with sharp eyes. Depends on who it was and what kind of proof they could provide. Jesse nodded and headed for the door, aware that he'd just committed himself to a course of action that would probably end his carefully maintained cover. But looking at the worried faces of the honest people in the saloon, he realized he couldn't let Marcus Hartwell pay for his actions. An hour later, Jesse rode out to the Hartwell Ranch to find the place in a state of controlled chaos. Ranch hands were positioning themselves for a siege, while Marcus and Rose worked to secure their most valuable possessions and prepare for the worst. Jake. Rose called out as he approached the main house. Thank God you're here. We heard about what happened in town. I know, Jesse said, dismounting near the porch. That's why I came out. We need to talk. Marcus emerged from the house carrying a rifle and wearing the grim expression of a man preparing for his final stand. "If you're here to tell us to surrender, you're wasting your time," he said firmly. "I'm not here to tell you to surrender," Jesse replied. "I'm here to tell you that I'm going to turn myself in to Sheriff Bradley." Both Rose and Marcus stared at him in shock. "What?" Rose gasped. "You can't do that." "I can and I will," Jesse said firmly. "Blackwood knows someone with exceptional skills was behind last night's attack. If I don't come forward, he'll keep pressuring the sheriff until Marcus gets arrested for something he didn't do. But if you confess, they'll hang you." Rose protested, her green eyes filling with tears. Jesse felt his heart clench at her obvious distress, but he forced himself to remain resolute. "Maybe. But that's better than letting innocent people suffer for my actions." Marcus stepped forward, his weathered face showing deep respect. "Son, what you're proposing is noble, but it's also suicide. Blackwood won't be satisfied with just arresting you. He'll want to make an example that scares everyone else into submission. Then we need to make sure he doesn't get that chance," Jesse replied. "There are other ways to handle this situation." Over the next hour, Jesse outlined a plan that was both audacious and dangerous. Instead of simply surrendering to Sheriff Bradley, he would arrange a public confrontation with Blackwood himself. A face-to-face meeting that would give Jesse the chance to end the conflict once and for all. "You're talking about calling out one of the most powerful men in the territory," Rose said, her voice tight with concern. "Even if you beat him in a gunfight, his money and influence will destroy you." "Not if he's exposed as the criminal he really is," Jesse countered. "Blackwood's power depends on maintaining the illusion that he's a legitimate businessman. Strip away that illusion and he becomes just another outlaw." Marcus was studying Jesse with growing understanding. "You've got something in mind beyond just challenging him to a gunfight." Jesse nodded. "I've been gathering information about Blackwood's operations for months. He's involved in everything from cattle rustling to political corruption, but he's been careful to keep his own hands clean. What we need is evidence that connects him directly to the violence against honest ranchers." "How do we get that evidence?" Rose asked. Jesse's smile was cold and professional. "By making him so angry that he does something stupid in front of witnesses who can't be bought or intimidated." As they refined the plan, Jesse found himself thinking about the risks involved. If he miscalculated, if Blackwood proved smarter or more cautious than expected, the consequences would be fatal for everyone involved. But looking at Rose's determined face and Marcus's stubborn courage, he realized that some things were worth any risk. "There's something else you need to know," Jesse said quietly. "Something about who I really am." Rose and Marcus waited expectantly as Jesse struggled with how much truth to reveal. Finally, he decided that if he was asking them to trust him with their lives, they deserved to know what they were getting into. "My name isn't Jake Morrison," he began. "It's Jesse McKenna. And I'm wanted by the law from here to California." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Rose's face went pale, while Marcus's eyes showed the shock of a man who just learned that everything he thought he knew was wrong. "What are you wanted for?" Rose asked quietly. "Bank robbery. Train robbery. Stealing from corrupt railroad companies and territorial officials." Jesse met her gaze steadily. "I'm what most people would call an outlaw, Rose. The kind of man your father taught you to avoid." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing this revelation. Finally he spoke. "Are you the kind of outlaw who hurts innocent people?" "No," Jesse replied firmly. "I only steal from people who've gotten rich by stealing from others. Corrupt politicians, crooked businessmen, railroad barons who use violence to get what they want." "Like Cyrus Blackwood," Rose said slowly. "Exactly like Cyrus Blackwood." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Well, that explains how you knew so much about fighting men like Slade and why you're so skilled with those guns of yours. Are you going to turn me in?" Jesse asked. Rose answered before her father could speak. "You saved my life, helped us fight for our home, and now you're willing to risk everything to protect Papa from being falsely arrested. As far as I'm concerned, you're exactly the kind of outlaw this territory needs." Marcus smiled at his daughter's fierce loyalty. "I agree. Sometimes the law isn't enough to protect good people from evil ones. If it takes an outlaw to fight injustice, then I'm proud to call that outlaw my friend." Jesse felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with whiskey and everything to do with acceptance from people whose opinion mattered to him. For the first time in 7 years, he wasn't alone in his fight against corruption and violence. "Thank you," he said simply. "Both of you." As evening approached, they finalized their plans for the confrontation with Blackwood. Jesse would ride into town the next morning and publicly challenge the railroad baron to settle their dispute like men, face to face in the street outside the sheriff's office. The challenge would be issued in front of enough witnesses to ensure that Blackwood couldn't simply have Jesse shot from ambush. What if he doesn't accept? Rose asked. He will, Jesse said confidently. Men like Blackwood can't resist the chance to publicly humiliate someone who's defied them. His ego won't let him back down from a challenge, especially one issued in front of the whole town. And if you're wrong? Marcus pressed. Jesse's smile was cold and dangerous. Then I'll make him wish he'd accepted the challenge. That night, as Jesse prepared to leave for what might be his final confrontation, Rose walked with him to the barn where midnight waited. The night air was cool and clear, filled with the familiar sounds of the frontier, cattle lowing, coyotes calling, and the whisper of wind through the grass. Jesse, Rose said quietly, using his real name for the first time. I want you to know something. He turned to look at her, struck once again by her beauty in the moonlight. What's that? I want you to know that meeting you has been the most important thing that's ever happened to me, she said simply. Regardless of what happens tomorrow, I'm grateful that you came into our lives. Jesse felt his carefully maintained emotional defenses crumbling. Rose? She stepped closer, her green eyes reflecting the starlight. I know you think you're not the kind of man who can offer a woman a future. But you're wrong. You're exactly the kind of man who makes a woman want to fight for that future. Before Jesse could respond, Rose rose on her tiptoes and kissed him gently. For a moment, the dangerous world around them disappeared, and there was nothing but the warmth of her lips and the promise of something beautiful in a life that had known too much violence. When they finally separated, Jesse rested his forehead against hers. If I survive tomorrow, he said quietly, I want to have a long conversation about that future you mentioned. When you survive tomorrow, Rose corrected firmly. Not if. When. Jesse smiled at her confidence, drawing strength from her faith in him. When I survive tomorrow, he agreed. As he rode away from the Hartwell Ranch toward whatever fate awaited him in Copper Creek, Jesse carried with him something he'd never had before, the love of a good woman and the hope that even an outlaw might find redemption in fighting for justice. The question was whether that hope would be enough to see him through the deadly game he was about to play with one of the most powerful and ruthless men in Arizona territory. Dawn broke clear and bright over Copper Creek, painting the adobe buildings in shades of gold and amber that reminded Jesse of Rose's hair. He sat in his room at the saloon, methodically cleaning and checking his weapons while mentally preparing for the confrontation that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of everyone he'd come to care about. Jesse had faced death many times during his 7 years as an outlaw, but this felt different. This wasn't just about survival or vengeance. This was about justice, about protecting innocent people, about proving that sometimes even an outlaw could be a force for good in a corrupt world. At precisely 9 o'clock, Jesse strapped on his gun belt, settled his black hat at the proper angle, and walked downstairs to face whatever destiny awaited him. Bill Thompson was behind the bar, polishing glasses with nervous energy, while several early customers nursed their drinks and spoke in hushed tones about the impending confrontation. Morning, Jake, Bill said, though his voice was tight with concern. Well, I don't rightly know what to call you now. Word of Jesse's true identity had spread through the small town like wildfire, carried by ranch hands who'd overheard the conversation at the Hartwell place. By now, everyone in Copper Creek knew that the quiet horse trader was actually Jesse the Shadow McKenna, one of the most wanted outlaws in the Southwest. Jesse will do fine, he replied, surprising himself with how good it felt to use his real name again. I'm tired of hiding behind false identities. Jesse, Bill said seriously, I want you to know that knowing who you really are doesn't change my opinion of you. You've been nothing but respectful and honorable since you arrived in town, and you've helped good people when they needed it most. Similar sentiments were echoed by the other customers, and Jesse realized that his reputation as an outlaw was actually working in his favor. In frontier communities, people respected strength and courage more than strict adherence to laws that were often written to benefit the wealthy and powerful. At 10 o'clock, Jesse stepped through the batwing doors onto the main street of Copper Creek. Word of his challenge to Blackwood had spread throughout the territory, and the normally quiet town was bustling with visitors who'd come to witness what promised to be a legendary gunfight. Sheriff Bradley was waiting on his porch, his weathered face showing the strain of a man caught between conflicting loyalties. As Jesse approached, the lawman stood up and walked out to meet him in the street. Jesse, Bradley said quietly, I have to ask you one more time, are you sure about this? It's not too late to reconsider. It's been too late since the moment Blackwood decided to use violence against innocent people, Jesse replied. This ends today one way or another. Bradley nodded grimly. Then I guess there's nothing left but to see how it plays out. For what it's worth, I hope you know what you're doing. As the morning progressed, more and more people gathered along the main street. Jesse could see Marcus and Rose among the crowd, their faces tense with worry but also showing the kind of pride that came from knowing they were about to witness something significant. At exactly 11:30, the sound of approaching horses announced Blackwood's arrival. The railroad baron rode into town at the head of a column of 20 hired guns, his presence as imposing as Jesse had expected. Blackwood was a tall man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in expensive Eastern clothing that marked him as someone who valued appearance and status. Cyrus Blackwood had the kind of face that belonged in a boardroom rather than on a frontier street, soft features that spoke of comfortable living, cold gray eyes that missed nothing, and the bearing of a man who was accustomed to having his every word treated as law. As Blackwood's entourage took positions along the street, Jesse noted that the man had indeed brought an army. The hired guns were professionals, the kind of men who sold their services to the highest bidder and had no qualms about shooting down anyone who threatened their employer's interests. Jesse McKenna, Blackwood called out, his voice carrying clearly across the street. I understand you have something to say to me. Jesse stepped away from the sheriff's office, his hands hanging loose at his sides but ready to draw at a moment's notice. I do indeed, Blackwood. I'm here to tell you that your war against the ranchers of this valley ends today. Blackwood's laugh was cold and contemptuous. You're in no position to make demands, Outlaw. You're surrounded by my men, wanted by the law and completely outgunned. I could have you shot down right here and claim I was defending myself against a dangerous criminal. You could try, Jesse replied calmly. But that would make you a murderer in front of all these witnesses. Even your money and influence might not protect you from the consequences of cold-blooded murder. Murder? Blackwood's voice rose with practiced indignation. You're a wanted criminal who's been terrorizing honest businessmen throughout the territory. Shooting you would be a public service. Jesse smiled coldly. Is that what you call it when your hired guns attack elderly ranchers and threaten women? Public service? A murmur ran through the crowd at Jesse's words. Many of the spectators were local people who knew the truth about Blackwood's methods, and they were clearly on Jesse's side despite his outlaw status. I don't know what you're talking about, Blackwood replied, but Jesse could see uncertainty flickering in the man's cold eyes. My business dealings are completely legitimate. Are they? Jesse asked loudly, making sure his words carried to every person watching. Tell that to Jim Williamson, whose barn you had burned and whose cattle you had shot. Tell that to the other ranchers you've driven off their land through intimidation and violence. You have no proof of these wild accusations, Blackwood snarled, his composure beginning to crack. Jesse reached into his vest and pulled out a folded document. Actually, I do. This is a signed confession from one of your former hired guns, a man named Pete Rafferty. He's described in detail how you ordered him and others to terrorize honest ranchers into selling their land for a fraction of its value. It was a bluff. Jesse had no such document, but he delivered the lie with such conviction that even Blackwood seemed to believe it. More importantly, the watching crowd believed it, and Jesse could see anger building in their faces as they contemplated the injustices they'd witnessed. That's impossible, Blackwood said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Rafferty also described how you ordered the attack on the Hartwell Ranch, Jesse continued, pressing his advantage. How you told Slade to make an example of anyone who refused to cooperate with your land grab. Blackwood's face was turning red with rage. You're lying. I never gave any such orders. Then why don't we ask Slade? Jesse suggested. I see him standing right behind you. Maybe he'd like to tell everyone about the orders he received regarding the ranchers in this valley. All eyes turned to Slade, who stood among Blackwood's hired guns with his arm in a sling from the wound he'd received during the gunfight at the Hartwell Ranch. The pale-eyed gunman's face went white as he realized he was being drawn into a confrontation he couldn't win. I don't know what you're talking about, Slade said, but his voice cracked with nervousness. Don't you? Jesse pressed. Then why did you tell Rose Hartwell that her family needed to accept Blackwood's generous offer before something unfortunate happened to them? Why did you attack an innocent woman in broad daylight? The crowd was growing increasingly hostile as Jesse's words sank in. These were frontier people who respected courage and honesty, and they had no tolerance for men who threatened women and used violence against those weaker than themselves. That's enough. Blackwood shouted, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely. I don't have to listen to the lies of a wanted criminal. Slade, kill this man. It was exactly the reaction Jesse had been hoping for. By ordering Slade to commit murder in front of dozens of witnesses, Blackwood had finally revealed his true nature and destroyed any claim to respectability. But Slade was already drawing his gun, and Jesse had to react instantly to save his own life. What happened next took place in the space of a heartbeat, but to the watching crowd it seemed to unfold with crystal clarity. Slade's gun had barely cleared its holster when Jesse's Colts appeared in his hands like magic, spitting fire and thunder with deadly precision. Slade's shot went wild, burying itself in the wooden sidewalk, while Jesse's bullets found their mark with the accuracy that had made him a legend throughout the Southwest. Slade crumpled to the ground, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the Arizona sky. "Anyone else want to try earning Blackwood's blood money?" Jesse asked, his smoking guns covering the remaining hired killers. But the fight had gone out of Blackwood's men. They were professionals who understood when they were outclassed, and none of them were eager to face the man who just demonstrated why he was considered one of the fastest guns in the territory. "This isn't over, McKenna," Blackwood snarled, but his voice carried the tone of a beaten man. "I'll see you hang for this." "No," Sheriff Bradley said, stepping forward with his own gun drawn, "you won't." Everyone turned to stare at the lawman, surprised by his intervention. Bradley's weathered face was grim but determined as he confronted the railroad baron. "Tom Bradley, what do you think you're doing?" Blackwood demanded. "That man is a wanted criminal." "That man just proved that you're a murderer and a criminal," Bradley replied firmly. "You ordered Slade to kill McKenna in front of dozens of witnesses. That makes you guilty of conspiracy to commit murder at the very least." "You can't arrest me," Blackwood protested. "I have friends in the territorial government. I have influence." "Maybe," Bradley acknowledged. "But right now you're in my town, and you just committed a felony in front of half the population. Your influence won't help you escape the consequences of your own actions." As Bradley moved to arrest Blackwood, Jesse found himself surrounded by townspeople offering congratulations and support. It was a strange experience for a man who'd spent 7 years as a hunted outlaw, and he wasn't entirely sure how to respond to such acceptance. "Jesse." Rose's voice cut through the crowd as she pushed her way toward him. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," he assured her, holstering his guns and catching her in his arms as she threw herself against his chest. "I was so scared," she whispered against his shirt. "When I saw Slade going for his gun I thought." "It's over," Jesse said softly, stroking her hair. "Blackwood's finished and his hired guns are going to scatter to the four winds. The ranchers are safe." Marcus appeared at Jesse's shoulder, his weathered face showing deep relief and gratitude. "Son, I don't know how we can ever repay you for what you've done." "You don't need to repay me," Jesse replied. "You gave me something I'd forgotten existed, a chance to fight for something good instead of just fighting against something bad." As the crowd began to disperse and Sheriff Bradley led the defeated Blackwood toward the jail, Jesse found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. With Blackwood's criminal empire exposed and destroyed, the threat to the valley's ranchers was over. But what did that mean for an outlaw with a price on his head? "Jesse," Rose said quietly, "what happens now?" It was a question he'd been dreading, because the answer would determine whether the hope he'd found in her arms could become something real and lasting, or whether his outlaw past would force him to ride away from the best thing that had ever happened to him. That evening, as the excitement of the day's events began to settle, Jesse found himself facing the most difficult decision of his life. The immediate threat to the Hartwell Ranch and the other honest ranchers of the valley was over, but his own future remained uncertain. He was still a wanted man with a bounty on his head, and no amount of heroics could change that fundamental fact. Jesse sat on the porch of the Hartwell Ranch house, watching the sun set over the mountains while grappling with the implications of his situation. Rose sat beside him, her hand in his, both of them aware that the peaceful moment might be one of their last together. "Sheriff Bradley came out this afternoon while you were in town," Rose said quietly. "He wanted to talk to Papa about your situation." Jesse turned to look at her, seeing worry and hope warring in her green eyes. "What did he say?" "He said that what you did today, exposing Blackwood and his criminal activities, might be enough to convince the territorial governor to grant you a pardon. Especially since you never hurt any innocent people during your outlaw career." Jesse felt a flutter of hope in his chest, but he forced himself to remain realistic. "Might isn't the same as will, Rose. There are powerful people who want to see me hang, regardless of what good I might have done." "There are also powerful people who owe their safety to what you did today," Marcus interjected, emerging from the house with 3 cups of coffee. Word is already spreading throughout the territory about how you exposed Blackwood's criminal empire. A lot of honest folks are going to be grateful for that. Jesse accepted the coffee gratefully, using the warm cup to steady his hands while he considered Marcus's words. It was true that his actions had probably saved dozens of ranchers from Blackwood's predatory schemes, but he wasn't naive enough to believe that gratitude alone could overcome the legal machinery that wanted him dead or imprisoned. Even if I could get a pardon, Jesse said slowly, that doesn't solve all our problems. I've made enemies during my outlaw career, men who won't forgive or forget regardless of what any governor might decree. Rose's grip tightened on his hand. Then we'll face those enemies together. No, Jesse said firmly, though the words cost him dearly. I won't put you in danger because of my past mistakes. You deserve better than a life spent looking over your shoulder, wondering when someone from my past might come calling with violence on their mind. That's my decision to make, Rose replied with the stubborn determination that had first attracted him to her. I'm not some helpless flower who needs protection from reality. I'm a rancher's daughter who knows how to fight for what she wants. And what is it that you want? Jesse asked softly. Rose turned to face him fully, her green eyes reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. I want a future with the man I love. I want to build something good and lasting with someone who understands the value of justice and courage. I want to help an outlaw find redemption, and I want him to help me build a legacy that would make my parents proud. Jesse felt his carefully maintained emotional defenses crumble completely at her words. Here was everything he'd never dared to dream of: love, acceptance, and the possibility of redemption through the eyes of a woman who saw past his mistakes to the man he could become. Rose, he said quietly, I love you more than I ever thought possible. But loving you means protecting you, even if that protection requires me to leave. It doesn't, Marcus said firmly. Son, I've been thinking about this situation all day, and I believe there's a way to solve all our problems. Both Jesse and Rose turned to look at the older man, hope and curiosity evident in their expressions. What do you mean, Papa? Rose asked. Marcus settled into his chair and took a sip of coffee before continuing. Jesse, you've spent 7 years as an outlaw because the system failed your family. You turned to robbery and violence because you saw no other way to fight against corruption and injustice. Jesse nodded, wondering where this was leading. But what you did today proves that there are other ways to fight those battles, Marcus continued. You exposed Blackwood's criminal activities, protected innocent people, and did it all within the bounds of the law. That's the kind of skill and courage that this territory desperately needs. I'm not following you, Jesse said. Sheriff Bradley is getting old, Marcus explained. He's been talking about retirement for the past 2 years, but he hasn't found anyone he trusts to take over his duties. Someone with your skills and your proven commitment to protecting honest folks would be exactly what this county needs. Jesse stared at Marcus in amazement. You're suggesting that I become a lawman? I'm suggesting that you become the kind of lawman this territory needs, Marcus corrected. Someone who understands both sides of the law, someone who can't be bought or intimidated, someone with the skills necessary to stand up to the kind of criminals who prey on honest people. Rose's eyes were shining with excitement. Papa, that's brilliant. Jesse already has the respect of everyone in the valley, and his reputation would make criminals think twice about operating in this area. But I'm still a wanted man, Jesse pointed out. How can an outlaw become a sheriff? By earning a pardon through exemplary service, Marcus replied. Sheriff Bradley thinks he can convince the territorial governor to grant you a provisional appointment, with the understanding that a full pardon will follow if you prove yourself in the position. Jesse found himself genuinely considering the possibility. It would mean giving up his life as a wandering outlaw, settling down in one place and taking responsibility for protecting an entire community. But it would also mean having a future with Rose, using his skills for legitimate purposes, and finding the kind of redemption he'd never thought possible. There's something poetic about it, Rose observed with a slight smile. Jesse, the Shadow McKenna, the outlaw who became a sheriff and found redemption in protecting the very law he once broke. It won't be easy, Jesse warned. There will be people who never accept that an outlaw can change, and there will be criminals from my past who see my badge as a betrayal that needs to be punished. We'll face those challenges when they come, Marcus said firmly. What matters now is that you have a chance to build something good from the ashes of your past mistakes. Jesse looked from Marcus to Rose, seeing hope and determination in both their faces. These were people who believed in second chances, who understood that redemption was possible for anyone willing to fight for it. All right, Jesse said finally. Let's talk to Sheriff Bradley. The next morning found Jesse, Rose, and Marcus riding into Copper Creek to meet with Sheriff Bradley about the proposed arrangement. The town was still buzzing with excitement from the previous day's events, and Jesse found himself greeted with smiles and respectful nods from people who had once viewed him with suspicion. Sheriff Bradley was waiting in his office, along with a distinguished-looking man in expensive Eastern clothing whom Jesse didn't recognize. "Jesse," Bradley said, rising to greet them, "I'd like you to meet Judge Harrison Whitmore. He's the Territorial Circuit Judge, and he's here to discuss your situation." Judge Whitmore was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of sharp, intelligent eyes that suggested he'd seen every type of human behavior during his long career. He studied Jesse with obvious interest as they shook hands. "Mr. McKenna," the judge said, "I've been hearing quite a lot about you. Your actions yesterday have created something of a sensation throughout the territory." "I hope that sensation is positive, Your Honor," Jesse replied carefully. "It is indeed," Whitmore assured him. "Word of how you exposed Cyrus Blackwood's criminal activities has reached the governor's office, and there's considerable interest in finding a way to reward your service to the community." Jesse felt his heart rate increase. "What kind of reward?" "Sheriff Bradley has proposed that you be appointed as his deputy, with the understanding that you would eventually take over his duties when he retires. In return, you would receive a full pardon for your past crimes, conditional on your exemplary service as a law enforcement officer." Jesse could hardly believe what he was hearing. After 7 years as a hunted outlaw, he was being offered not just freedom, but a chance to serve on the right side of the law. "There are conditions, of course," Judge Whitmore continued. "You would be required to make restitution for any money you stole during your outlaw career, insofar as that's possible. You would also be expected to use your knowledge of criminal activities to help other law enforcement agencies throughout the territory." "I can live with those conditions," Jesse said without hesitation. The money he'd stolen had come from corrupt sources anyway, and he'd always intended to see it return to its rightful owners eventually. "There's one more thing," the judge added. "Your appointment would be provisional for the first year. If you prove yourself worthy of the trust we're placing in you, the pardon becomes permanent. If not—" he left the implication hanging. "If not, I go back to being a hunted outlaw," Jesse finished. "I understand, Your Honor." Judge Whitmore smiled. "I don't think that will be necessary, Mr. McKenna. From everything I've heard, you're exactly the kind of man this territory needs wearing a badge." Over the next hour, they worked out the details of Jesse's appointment. He would start as Sheriff Bradley's deputy immediately, learning the administrative and legal aspects of law enforcement while using his existing skills to deal with the more dangerous elements of the job. "There's just one more thing we need to discuss," Sheriff Bradley said as they prepared to finalize the arrangement. "Your name." Jesse looked at him with confusion. "What about my name?" "Well," Bradley explained, "Jesse McKenna is still a wanted outlaw technically speaking. But Jake Morrison is just a horse trader with a clean record. Might be easier for everyone if you kept using that name, at least officially." Jesse considered this suggestion, then shook his head. "No, Sheriff. I'm done hiding behind false identities. If I'm going to be a lawman, I'm going to do it as Jesse McKenna. Let people see that an outlaw can change, that redemption is possible for anyone willing to work for it." Judge Whitmore nodded approvingly. "I think that's the right decision, Deputy McKenna. Your example could inspire other men who've made mistakes to choose a better path." As they left the sheriff's office, Jesse found himself wearing a deputy's badge for the first time in his life. It was a strange feeling. The weight of the metal star on his chest seemed to represent all the hopes and responsibilities he was taking on. "How does it feel?" Rose asked as they walked toward the saloon for a celebratory drink. "Terrifying," Jesse admitted. "But also right, somehow. Like this is what I was meant to do all along." Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. "That's because it is what you were meant to do, son. Sometimes it just takes a while to find our true calling." That evening, as they sat around the Hartwell family dinner table, Jesse found himself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this point. A week ago, he'd been a lonely outlaw with no future beyond his next robbery. Now he was a deputy sheriff with a chance at redemption, surrounded by people who cared about him and believed in his ability to change. "Jesse," Rose said softly, "I have something to ask you." He looked at her with curiosity. "What's that?" Rose glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly. "I want to know if you'd be interested in a partner." "A partner?" "Someone to help you with your law enforcement duties. Someone who knows the territory, understands the people, and isn't afraid of danger." Rose's eyes sparkled with mischief. Someone who's already proven she can handle herself in a crisis. Jesse stared at her in amazement. You want to be a deputy? Why not? I can shoot as well as most men, I know every rancher and cowhand in 3 counties, and I'm tired of sitting on the sidelines while other people fight for justice. Marcus laughed at Jesse's expression. She's been talking about this all day. I think she's serious. But Rose, Jesse protested, law enforcement is dangerous work. I couldn't bear the thought of you getting hurt because of my job. And I couldn't bear the thought of you facing that danger alone when I could be helping you, Rose replied firmly. We're partners in everything else, Jesse McKenna. Why should this be any different? Jesse looked into her determined green eyes and realized that he was fighting a losing battle. Rose Hartwell had made up her mind, and experience had already taught him that arguing with her when she was determined was a futile exercise. All right, he said finally. But if we're going to be law enforcement partners, we need to make it official in every way possible. Rose looked at him with curiosity. What do you mean? Jesse stood up from the table and walked around to where Rose was sitting. To her amazement and Marcus's obvious delight, he dropped to one knee beside her chair and took her hand in his. Rose Hartwell, Jesse said softly, I love you more than life itself. You've shown me that redemption is possible, that even an outlaw can find his way back to the light. Will you marry me? Will you be my partner in law enforcement, in building a future together, and in everything else that life brings our way? Rose's eyes filled with tears of joy as she looked down at the man who'd come into her life like a force of nature and changed everything for the better. Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. As Jesse slipped his mother's ring, the only memento he'd kept from his destroyed childhood, onto Rose's finger, Marcus raised his coffee cup in a toast. To second chances, the older man said, and to the kind of love that can redeem even the darkest past. To second chances, Jesse and Rose echoed, their voices blending in perfect harmony. 1 year later, Sheriff Jesse McKenna stood on the porch of the Copper Creek Sheriff's Office, watching the sun rise over the peaceful valley that had become his home. The morning air was crisp and clear, filled with the promise of another day in a life he'd never dared to imagine possible. The past year had brought challenges and changes beyond anything Jesse could have anticipated. His reputation as a former outlaw who'd become a lawman had spread throughout Arizona territory, attracting both admiration from honest folks and threats from criminal elements who saw his transformation as a betrayal of their code. But Jesse had faced every challenge with the support of his wife and partner, Deputy Rose McKenna, whose courage and intelligence had proven invaluable in their shared mission of bringing justice to the frontier. Together, they cleaned up 3 counties, arresting dozens of criminals and restoring peace to communities that had been terrorized by outlaws and corrupt officials. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Jesse's attention to a familiar figure riding down the main street. Judge Whitmore approached the sheriff's office with the dignified bearing that had marked his long career in territorial service. "Morning, Your Honor," Jesse called out as the judge dismounted. "You're up early." "I have important business to conduct, Sheriff," Whitmore replied with a smile. "Business that I believe you'll find very interesting." Rose emerged from the office carrying 2 cups of coffee and the morning's correspondence. At 7 months pregnant with their first child, she'd finally agreed to limit her patrol duties, though she still insisted on handling the administrative aspects of law enforcement. "Judge Whitmore," she said warmly, "what brings you to Copper Creek so early?" "I bring news from the territorial capital," the judge announced formally. "Sheriff McKenna, after careful review of your service record over the past year, the governor has signed a document that I think you'll want to see." Judge Whitmore reached into his coat and withdrew an official-looking document sealed with the territorial seal. Jesse accepted it with hands that trembled slightly as he realized what he was holding. "A full and complete pardon," the judge announced, "for all crimes committed prior to your appointment as a law enforcement officer. Furthermore, the governor has asked me to convey his personal gratitude for your exemplary service to the people of Arizona Territory." Jesse felt tears sting his eyes as the weight of 7 years as a hunted outlaw finally lifted from his shoulders. He was truly free now, free to build a future without looking over his shoulder, free to raise a family without fear that his past would endanger them. "Thank you, Your Honor," Jesse said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than I can possibly express." "You've earned it, Sheriff," Judge Whitmore replied. "Your transformation from outlaw to lawman has become legendary throughout the Southwest. You've proven that redemption is possible for anyone willing to work for it." As the judge prepared to leave, he paused to add one final piece of news. "Oh, and Sheriff, the governor has also asked me to inform you that when the territory achieves statehood, you'll be under serious consideration for appointment as a federal marshal. It seems your reputation for integrity and effectiveness has reached Washington." After Judge Whitmore departed, Jesse and Rose sat together on the porch, watching their town come alive with the activities of another peaceful day. Marcus Hartwell rode up to the office as he did every morning, to check on his daughter and son-in-law. "Morning, you two," Marcus called out cheerfully. "How are my favorite law enforcement officers today?" After Judge Whitmore departed, Jesse and Rose sat together on the porch, watching their town come alive with the activities of another peaceful day. Marcus Hartwell rode up to the office as he did every morning, to check on his daughter and son-in-law. "Morning, you two," Marcus called out cheerfully. "How are my favorite law enforcement officers today?" "We're officially pardoned law enforcement officers," Rose replied, waving the governor's document. "Jesse's past is finally buried for good." Marcus dismounted and embraced them both, his weathered face showing the pride and joy of a man who'd seen his faith in human redemption vindicated. "I always knew this day would come," Marcus said. "From the moment I saw you risk your life to protect my daughter from Slade and his men, I knew you were a good man who'd simply lost his way for a while." As they talked, other townspeople began stopping by to congratulate Jesse on his pardon and to express their gratitude for the peace and security his leadership had brought to their community. It was a far cry from the lonely existence he'd known as an outlaw, when his only companions were his horse and his guns. "You know," Rose said softly, resting her head against Jesse's shoulder, "I've been thinking about names for the baby." "Oh," Jesse replied, stroking her hair gently. "What did you have in mind?" "If it's a boy, I was thinking we might call him Thomas after Sheriff Bradley. And if it's a girl?" Rose smiled up at her husband. "I was thinking Grace. Because that's what you found here, the grace to start over and become the man you were always meant to be." Jesse felt his heart swell with love for this remarkable woman who'd seen past his outlaw reputation to the possibility of redemption. "Grace McKenna," he said softly. "I like the sound of that." As the morning progressed and Jesse began his daily rounds of the town, he reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him from the darkness of his outlaw years to the light of his new life. He'd learned that redemption was indeed possible, but it came with a price: the courage to admit past mistakes, the strength to change fundamental aspects of one's character, and the wisdom to surround oneself with people who believed in the possibility of transformation. Most importantly, he'd learned that love, the love of a good woman, the acceptance of a chosen family, and the respect of a community, could indeed conquer even the darkest past and create a future bright with hope and possibility. Jesse the Shadow McKenna, the notorious outlaw who'd terrorized corrupt officials throughout the Southwest, was gone forever. In his place stood Sheriff Jesse McKenna, a man dedicated to protecting the innocent, upholding justice, and proving that even the most unlikely people could find redemption in the vast, unforgiving, but ultimately hopeful landscape of the American frontier. As he walked the peaceful streets of Copper Creek, his badge gleaming in the morning sun and his pregnant wife by his side, Jesse knew that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all those years, not just justice for his murdered parents, but peace for his own troubled soul. The Gunsmoke had cleared, the roses were blooming, and somewhere in the vast Arizona sky, Jesse's parents were finally resting in peace, knowing that their son had found his way home at last. In the distance, a coyote howled its ancient song to the desert morning, but now it sounded less like loneliness and more like freedom. The freedom that comes when a man finally stops running from his past and starts building toward his future. Jesse McKenna was home.